At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
Hello, memoir and writers. I am Grant Faulkner at Memoir Nation, and I'm happy to say that Pro Writing Aid is now sponsoring this podcast. And I'm happy about that because I have used Pro Writing Aid, both as a grammar checker, but more importantly, as a tool to help me structure and probe questions in my book. And the main tool I have used is their manuscript analysis tool. It provides full manuscript developmental feedback in minutes. And to tell you the truth, I was initially dubious of it, but when I used it, it helped me uncover plot holes and think about different structural possibilities and see how my pacing worked. And I liked it because it was kind of like a beta reader because it opened up questions for me to consider. But I want to emphasize not solutions, just questions. And it made me more aware of some story elements to consider. So I essentially emerged from that analysis with a revision plan in hand. Just so you know, Pro Writing Aid's goal is not to automate storytelling. It's to make the process of writing richer and more empowering by opening up questions to consider your writing. Also, many of Pro Writing Aid's competitors support only one part of the writing process, but Pro Writing Aid has tools to help writers, from the first spark of inspiration to the polished draft. And it really is focused on creative writing, not business writing and stuff like that. So here's the dramatic ending. We have an exclusive discount for you. If you type in memoir, all caps memoir, to the promo code box on the purchase page, you'll get 20% off all annual subscription plans. So I encourage you to type in memoir when you sign up for Pro Writing Aid and get 20% off, and write and revise, write and revise, write and revise. Thank you, Memoir Nation listeners.
Hello, experimenters, form enthusiasts, and book builders. Welcome to Memoir Nation. I am Brooke Warner. I'm here with Grant Faulkner, as always, and welcome to an episode that covers a lot of ground, in part because the book that we're covering today does so too. And we have to take our lead from the authors that we interview, always. Grant, you and I have both been very taken lately with memoirs' evolving forms. And I love to interview an author like today's guest, Danielle Bainbridge, because she is really at once defying conventions, but also modeling what we can do with memoir, maybe what we might call new memoir or modern memoir. And so her book is called Dandelion, a memoir and essays. My publishing background leads me to speculate that this book would have been better served with a more explanatory subtitle, though, something like I would have gone with Musings on Mental Illness, Race, and Silence, something along those lines for the keywords, only because the book is provocative in so many ways. And I really wanted to see that provocativeness in the package and the presentation for this book, which is so wonderful. And even more so, honestly, after I read it.
Yeah, that's interesting, Brooke. And I know historically that memoirs and essays have been a tough sell. Danielle's publisher is a small press called Jaded Ibis Press that has a really incredible mission. They're a feminist press committed to publishing socially engaged literature with an emphasis on the voices of people of color. And they welcome submissions from women, writers of color, writers with disabilities, queer writers, and other silenced or culturally marginalized voices. And it's always so heartening to see presses like these because they are committed to putting out work that would not otherwise be heard. And I think that's heroic. So out of curiosity, Brooke, what was it about the pitch that made you say yes when you saw it? Because we see so many pitches.
Yeah, and that's a really good question because we do. And it can be hard to get the attention of anyone who's in a decision-making role when it comes to media. I mean, when you think about it, like ours is actually a pretty small podcast. And so when you're trying to get onto these big podcasts and you're like one of a gajillion. And so it is interesting to think about what catches our eye. And I would say we at this point are getting like 50 submissions a month, maybe 40 or 50. And so it was the feminist part for me, because Seal Press was explicitly feminist, of course, and I will always have a soft spot in my heart for the work of feminist presses. And interestingly, though, it was also the fact that Danielle had this really great blurb from Myriam Gurba, who we had just recently interviewed. And I thought to myself, if Myriam likes this woman's work, then it must be good. So here is the power of a strong blurb, everyone. For anyone who's trying to tell you that they don't matter or that they don't open doors, they do. Myriam calls Danielle's work kaleidoscopic. I love that word. And I thought it would be a good word for us to ruminate on a bit, Grant, because I think kaleidoscopic speaks to exactly what we like about these new trends in memoir, which is that you can come in anywhere, like into the writing from all angles. And I love the way that Danielle constructed this book. And I find it very creative, very compelling. And like I said, at the same time, my traditional publishing and commercial mindset couldn't help but kick into gear a couple of points, and she actually mentions this when we asked her about doing the small press. Like a bigger publisher said, well, if you do this and if you do that, and she was like, nope, I didn't want to compromise. And so she has this book that she really wanted to do this way. And it is it's special. And it also, I think, gives other memoirists a lot of permission to do this kind of creative work.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad she stuck with her vision and that she found a publisher. Danielle's book is just so up my alley in what I'll call the collage memoir while renaming subgenres. Because she's got poetry and lists and snippets of journals and a letter to Maya Angelou. And she toggles between first, second, and third person, which is really interesting. So she's really doing that memoir as collage work that I personally love and that I'm working actually to integrate into my memoir. It's harder than it looks, I'll just say that. But of course, I recognize that my own work is often literary or has those aims. And so even as I say this, I know what you mean about works like these being, less commercial and by extension, less saleable to a certain kind of publisher. Like Danielle, I've found my niche among university presses and smaller publishers, and I don't really even think about big houses any longer, which is very comforting and liberating, to tell you the truth. So if someone you were working with had a book like Danielle's book, what publishing advice would you give them?
Basically to do exactly what she did, to seek out a small press or a university press. Her work is very beautiful, compelling, experimental, thought-provoking. So if Danielle had been my student or one of my coaching clients, I would have never tried to steer her away from her choices in terms of how she's constructed her narrative. But I would have told her that she's facing an uphill battle to get traditional publishers on board. And I do tell my students and my clients that all the time, actually, because, what we're seeing in book publishing mirrors exactly what we're seeing in film. The big studios are increasingly unlikely to take risks, whereas the small indie studios can and will. And I think this is actually a silver lining in all of this consolidation that we've seen both in book publishing in the last 20 years and more recently with film, certainly culminating right now with this merger of Time Warner and Paramount, which is that these biggies, which were once such important paragons of, everything cultural to the industry, they actually do start to lose their credibility with audiences because audiences and readers want things that make us think. And we don't want formulaic work all the time. And sure, we want a celebrity-studded film or a celebrity memoir from time to time, but we also want creative work that changes how we think about things. And that's how I feel about Dandelion. This book by Danielle, it is an expression of all of the things that we're seeing in memoir right now that you and I have been tracking so closely, gathered together in this beautiful series of essays. Only it's more than essays. Like, that's the only thing that I'll say.
Yeah,
more than essays.
We got to give you editorial control over that title, I think. But yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. And I face this same conundrum actually with my novel, The Letters, which I had been trying to sell to a bigger press and get, fancy agents to represent it. But it's a very unconventional novel because it's an epistolary novel. And even though there is now an epistolary novel that is a bestseller, The Correspondent, I couldn't break through with mine. And I haven't read The Correspondent yet. It's on my list. But with mine, I received notes to make it more commercial. But those notes, like Danielle's, were always in conflict with the heart of the novel and my vision for it and my whole reason to write it. And then I told the story on this podcast about my book about rejection, how 3 different acquiring editors wanted to buy the book, and it was voted down by the other powers that be after that. And I just don't think they understood the market for a book like that. I've had so many MFA programs and professors and writers, tell me that they'd structure a whole class around a book like this, but it just doesn't fit the mold of other writing books. So it was a tough sell. It was out of their kind of convention. So both of those books now are with the University of New Mexico Press, which did a great job of publishing my previous two books. And I'm completely happy. You know, like I said earlier, it's liberating to leave the big houses. Not that I left. They never really opened the doors. But it was a little bit
to you.
yeah. Very liberating. It was kind of like getting out of a bad relationship, I think. Because I love that my books are different and that they have appeal because they're different. And even though I'm not going to get the marketing muscle or even maybe the street cred of a big publisher, I'm happy to have found a good home, not just for my books, but for me as a writer. You know, I had drinks with my editor at AWP, the director of marketing, and my publicist. They answer my emails right away. We talk with each other. We like each other. We make plans together. So I'm curious, Brooke, looking back on all the books you did at Seal, if while you were reading Danielle's book, there was anything that jarred your memory, like did you work on books like hers when you were at Seal?
A lot. And I think that was the thing, like I said, when I saw her pitch from her publicist, I was like, oh, these remind me of the kinds of books that I would have done when I was at Seal, the whole press, in fact, and explicitly Danielle's book. So the book that came to mind for me most specifically is a book that I did called Desire, Women Write About Wanting. And that was a collection of essays by Lisa Solid Warren. And I am still proud of acquiring that book. And it was cool because I went on to Seal's website and they're with Hachette now, and the book is still in print. And it was similarly provocative. You know, it was a thinking book about women and wanting and desire. And I just love a provocative book in general. And what I mean by that is something that makes me think, that presses up against the boundaries of my comfort a lot of times, something that gives me deeper insight into human behavior, impulses, compulsions, drives. And the thing that struck me most about Dandelion is the way that Danielle writes about the dismissiveness with which we treat people with mental health issues, and how cruelly we treat the most vulnerable among us. And I wanted to read this little passage of hers toward the end of the book. It says, I have spent my life in conflict with my body, conflict with my mood disorder, but also with this fat Black woman, queer immigrant's daughter, American body that I was blessed with. I have spent years at war trying to feel something different or better or sustainable in any way possible. That man at the station, and here she's referring to a homeless, mentally ill man that she comes across. That man at the station scared me to my core. Was this my future? Old-time church people in my childhood would often say, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Is that where I am destined to go without pills and healthcare and money to pay for pills and healthcare? And she goes on. So I found this and many other passages really, like I said, thought-provoking, self-revealing. You're going to ask her this question when we get into the interview, Grant, but there were so many readers that called her writing raw. And I think that this is where you see it shine through, you know, when she confesses her fears that she might lose her health insurance, that she could end up homeless, crazy, dead, right? I mean, all kinds of things. And really, we're all just hanging on by a thread sometimes. And she brings that to the fore in ways that are discomforting, but also very real. And, you know, I just kind of feel like I'm better for having read this collection. And that's usually the best measure of any book, but certainly a memoir in my estimation.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, Brooke, because just hearing you read that short passage, you know, made me think of all of the unhoused people that I walk by in the city relatively regularly, if not frequently. And when I first moved here, I noticed every person I passed, in part because I'd never lived in a place with the unhoused. And now it's just so commonplace in my life that I walk by without noticing, you know, without truly recognizing them as human beings in pain. And this is why we need stories like this, you know, to alert us and to awaken us and to help us care more and hopefully take action so that people with mental health conditions can not only afford their pills, but also afford a warm bed to lie in. So I look forward to learning more from Danielle after this short break.
Welcome back to Memoir Nation, everyone. Today's guest is Danielle Bainbridge, an assistant professor of theater, Black studies, and performance studies at Northwestern University. Her first academic book was Currencies of Cruelty, Slaveries, Freak Shows, and the Performance Archive, which came out last year from NYU Press. And today we are talking about her memoir, Dandelion. Danielle has received scholarships and residencies from Tin House, the Adirondack Center for Writing, the Banff Centre in Canada. Her web series and media work have been nominated for three Daytime Emmy Awards and one NAACP Image Award. She is joining us from Chicago, where she lives with her partner and two naughty cats. Do they sometimes show up on podcasts, Danielle?
Oh, yeah, all the time. There was one on the table right when we signed on. So,
well, we'll see if one makes an appearance, and we're very happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Your book is a collection of essays, but they're so varied and they cover a lot of different topics. And a very great review in the Adroit Journal said of your collection, Dandelion is a symphonic ode to Black selfhood, feminist values, and life with bipolar. And I know that collections often morph over time. And you told us in advance of this interview that you were inspired to write this book after one of your hospitalizations for bipolar depression in your mid-20s. And that what started as one essay quickly, well, maybe not quickly, over time became a collection. So I'm assuming that essay was the hospital, the spit in my mouth heals the wounds on my tongue. It's a tour de force. And so I wondered if you could open by talking more about what that essay means to you and then how it turned out to be a catalyst for this book.
Yeah, so I was really interested in essays probably towards the end of college, early grad school, just interested in the form, interested in what they made possible. And I also just like to read them. I didn't have any experience writing any, which, you have to start somewhere. So I started there. And I had this experience where I was hospitalized in my mid-20s. And I wanted to write something that helped me make sense of that, mostly for myself, actually. This was before I was diagnosed, before I really knew what was going on. It felt to me at the time very random, like this sort of interruption from my real life that was being a grad student and, being a person who was very career oriented and all of this other stuff. And then I thought, well, this is a break from that. This is an interruption of the timeline I'm supposed to have been on. And the thing about life is that even if it doesn't feel like the correct timeline, there is only the one that you're on. So you have to either make peace with it or live in denial. And I decided I was going to make peace with it. So I started writing this essay for that particular reason. And I think in part, the reason that it's in the third person is because it felt like this foreign thing had happened to me, like this strange other person was living my life and experiencing these kind of traumatic instances of mental health crises. So I wrote it in the third person. And I just said, okay, I'm going to try something here. And something became a lot of some things. And, it had a lot of different kinds of experimentation in it. And as I got to the end of it, I thought, okay, well, I like this essay and maybe I could publish it. Because if there's one thing I'm going to do, it's try to make some sort of career-oriented choice out of an artistic impulse. So I was like, okay, maybe I could publish this thing. So I sent it out to a lot of places. I got a lot of rejections, like over 20. And then it won an essay contest. And that kind of inspired me to think, well, maybe there's more story to tell. And out of that one essay, then I started writing the other ones and just kind of slowly developing them over time, piece after piece. And it took about 10 years until all of them were done. But that first one, I think, gave me a lot of permission to try out different kinds of voice and different kinds of experiments with essay. And I really liked that. And I found that really rewarding and fulfilling. So, I just kept going after that.
Danielle, that's quite both a writing journey and a life journey. I love that. And thank you for sharing it. In the reviews of your work, I often read a lot of mentions of raw writing and honesty. And I wonder if you could speak to your reaction to that kind of praise. I think most memoirists aim for that, but it's definitely not easy to achieve. So did you need to tap into something specific to get to that, or did it come naturally to you?
I think some of it came more naturally than others. Being honest about myself was easy enough. Not easy, but, easier than I'd say being honest about people in my life. I think I felt more responsibility to the people I loved to kind of keep them not out of it, but less of a centerpiece of it. Because I thought, well, they're not consenting to sharing all of these personal, kind of confessional things. And I am choosing to write this. So, I don't talk that much about members of my family or, about specific people. Like, I'll talk about people, but I anonymize them, for obvious reasons. And I think giving myself permission to do that, to say, okay, all the things that happened to me belong to me, and I'm entitled to tell my story, but that doesn't mean that I should harm someone else in the process of trying to tell my story. And I think a lot of the reviews, which were interesting to me, because I thought like I was withholding quite a lot, which there's a lot more to the story that I, chose not to write about, because you make choices even in autobiographical writing. You have to make a decision for the sake of story and plot and progress of the book and things like that. And there was a lot that I was talking to my partner the other day saying, I didn't include this, or I didn't include that, or I could have said this, or I could have said that. And it's interesting that I think a lot of people's reaction was thinking, oh my God, like you've said so much. And my reaction was, oh, I could have said more. So I think, it just depends on who's reading it, I guess.
More books in your future, I think, Danielle. So there are multiple places in this collection where you're expressing empathy and compassion with other people who have mental health diagnoses. And you specifically highlight other Black people who are dismissed and victimized, in some cases incarcerated, murdered, and because or as a result of a mental illness in some of these cases. And so I just thought this was an interesting device, the use of empathy and compassion, kind of putting yourself in a way like adjacent to other people's outcomes. And I was wondering if you could talk about that choice. Like at one point you do use the words of there, but for the grace of God go I, and I was wondering if that was an approach to this subject matter or, like a way in.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. I think as these stories of people who were having, particularly Black people who were having mental health crises and then had either violent encounters with police or with, other, just people, it really impacted me, especially after I was diagnosed, thinking without the support I have in my life, like access to healthcare, access to medication and therapy, access to, family members who could support me and understand me and friends who could do the same, what would my life be like, or what would it be? How would it be different? And I don't presume that any of these people who had these violent encounters didn't have access to these things, because that's not necessarily the point either, but more that I think my life would have been much different, could have been much different if I didn't have some of the privilege that I do have. And I think that that connection or that feeling of empathy is also because, having experienced, major psychiatric issues, I sometimes see people, suffering or experiencing these same issues, and I just feel for them because I know what it feels like in your body to have that sort of disorientation, that feeling of being divorced from yourself or out of control or unable to really manage the day-to-day. And a lot of my 20s were kind of spent wrestling with those challenges. And I'd say like the blessing of, diagnosis in some ways is that diagnosis is not a sentence, it's information. It gave me information to understand myself and to understand some of the things that had happened to me. But it also meant that I was now part of a certain kind of label of like person with, chronic mental illness, and that people have really, most people have really strong opinions about what that looks like or what that should be like. And I think part of why I make that parallel in the book so often is because I wanted to encourage people to not only think about people that they see in the world who are struggling, but also maybe people in their own lives who are struggling and not being as forthcoming. Because oftentimes when I give readings from this book, or I do events or things like that, someone will come up to me afterwards and say like my brother or my cousin or my child or my mother has bipolar depression or schizophrenia or, suffers with some other challenge. And it becomes this sort of connection between me and the people who have read the book that it opens them up to talk about these things that we otherwise consider oftentimes very shameful, or things that should be hidden. And I think part of my ambition in writing this whole thing was to inspire people to think empathetically about mental illness. And that included, people includes me. I think I have my own bias and my own messed up ways of thinking about things sometimes. And I think writing this book was a lesson in re-educating my brain about what it means to have this diagnosis.
That's so interesting, Danielle, especially the way you say that, the diagnosis wasn't, you initially thought of it as an interruption in your life, and then it becomes your life. And I think anyone who's had a diagnosis of something severe, that's the way it is. You're altered. And Brooke and I, it's interesting what you just said about normalizing these diagnoses or like opening up the discussion of them, because Brooke and I have gone through the history of memoir, and so many taboo subjects are normalized or brought to the public conversation because of memoir. And was that one of the driving forces of your writing, to lift up that conversation? Because you've obviously gone through a lot of personal confession with this, but then there's this whole other cultural, societal part. And I think it's interesting that you talked about having to normalize it for yourself, I guess.
Yeah, I think some of my ambition is to just say, this is an experience that I had. And, in some ways it's like I had to learn to listen to myself, because I think for anyone to be convinced or to want to listen to you, you have to listen to yourself first. Like as a writer, you please yourself first. Hopefully that's what you're doing, is pleasing yourself first. But I also think as this book has come out, a lot of what I've been driven by was speaking across difference. Because, when my students will ask me about art or things like that, like what's the purpose of making theater, purpose of making work, I think, it's to speak across difference. It's to say, I had this feeling, thought, experience, sensation, idea, whatever it is. And we are, however far apart. And I want to speak across that distance to you so that you could understand that feeling, thought, emotion, idea, whatever it may be. And I think in some ways, I was doing that with myself when I first started the book, was speaking across a difference of the self I thought I was versus the self that I now had become as a result of these health crises. And also to reframe it as a health issue was kind of interesting for me, because I think, a lot of my initial feelings of resistance to diagnosis and to treatment in some ways was the idea that I didn't want to have anything that felt permanent or irreparable. I wanted to say this was a siloed incident and it happened and now I'm past it, or I've been cured, or I've been healed. And I think that impulse was hard to get over, was hard to realize that this was something that I would live with pretty much, my whole life, that it would be a part of how I negotiate the world, how I negotiate healthcare. It's something I disclose to my medical providers. Like, it comes up more often than I thought at the beginning, but it also means that a lot of, going back to the idea of empathy, a lot of the empathy I had to first extend in writing this book was empathy for myself in some ways, and empathy for the things I had experienced, and also the things I had done that maybe I wasn't proud of, or that, I didn't want to write a book where I was like the hero and I went through some terrible thing and then I came out on the other side and, everything was fine and we all learned something valuable along the way. Like, I didn't necessarily want to write that story because that's not how I experienced my life. But I think, as I was trying to engage readers, I just had to, and speak across that difference, I first had to start empathizing with my own experiences.
It's really touching, actually, because, I've worked with a lot of people who have mental health diagnoses, all different kinds, and I think that process is, sometimes what brings you to the book, but it sometimes also resolves itself through the writing of the book. And I did want to ask you another question about form, because you do a lot of interesting things in this book. And one is that you explain to the reader what you're doing in various places. Like in the introduction, you're explaining to the reader that you wrote these essays over 10 years. And then later in the book, you talk about your journaling process. In the essay, if we can call it an essay, Goat Mouth, you write about process, and then you share again to the reader. You say, these fragments were written and arranged up until the night before I was involuntarily admitted to the hospital for psychiatric evaluation. And then you detail these many fragments with dates and timestamps. So could you talk more about including those pieces and what you wanted readers to see with that?
I'm always really interested in process. I think, I've been thinking about my grandfather a lot recently. He recently passed in December. And he was a man who my mom used to always get annoyed because he would take things and open them up, like little clocks, watches, random like electronics. He'd open them up because he wanted to see how they worked. And then he never knew how to put them back together. And, my mom said, like, my grandmother used to have to hide her wristwatch because he was always opening things up. And the last thing that he did that to was his hearing aid. He was losing his hearing towards the end of his life. And my mom got him a hearing aid. And then one day, the aide who took care of him, the home health aide, came in and all the pieces were on the floor, like in a row, because he had broken it open. And he still had that instinct. And I think a lot of that curiosity is something that I carry with me. I like in my work to take things apart and to see how they work. When I read something that's very satisfying, my first instinct, and maybe this is also because I work as a historian and scholar, like a lot of my instinct is, how does this work? How did we get this feeling? Or how did they make us get to this revelation or this moment in the story? And I think revealing some of that in the book was interesting to me, but it was also like a part of going back through a lot of different documents. Like Goat Mouth was going back to that document and saying, like, what in the actual hell is this? And thinking like, okay, in a manic, state, I sat down and was doing this stuff with my journal and putting things together and putting them in different order. And like, it all made sense in the moment, but didn't make sense in actuality. And I put it in the book because in some part, I thought this is probably the closest document I have that is like a witness to those moments of real dysregulation. I don't have any like videos of myself or things like that during that moment, but I have this writing, and writing is such a thing for me and has always been such a mode of expression for me that I think it was almost kind of interesting to me to read it and to go back to these moments and think, like, why did I do this? Or what motivated this? Or, how did this work? Or why was I breaking apart all these journal entries and putting them together in this specific order? And I think a lot of the notes and the asides and things that come in the book come from that same instinct of wanting to see how things work on their inside and to display that a little bit. So, thank you for the question, because it actually just kind of, I never thought about why I did it before in a very specific way, but, it was nice. It was nice to be able to like have that articulation and also to think about like where it comes from a little bit and think of my grandfather.
You.
I love your story. That's got to be another essay. Perfect metaphor for the writing process. Well, Danielle, Maya Angelou is an inspiration for you. And in the seminal essay we talked about earlier, you write her a letter and you talk about your shyness and your silence, and you sign the letter Silent Black Girl. And in the letter, you share why and how she was an inspiration to you, why you related to her. And you talk about your shyness and your silence, but you don't actually share the story that Dr. Angelou writes about in I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which is that, and I'll use Maya here only because Dr. Angelou is a child, but she withdraws and remains mute for months. And I'm not remembering how many, but because the man who sexually assaulted her, her mother's boyfriend, gets murdered, presumably by Maya's uncles. And she feels guilty and withdraws from everyone but her brother. And I'm just wondering if the reason for her silence, mattered to you, or was it just that she too had been silent and she modeled a way to rise up?
I think it was more the latter for me.
Mm-hmm.
And early in the collection, it's also interesting to me that like a lot of times when people read things about mental health, they look for a metaphorical kind of like smoking gun, like a thing that happened or a trauma or an instance that kind of marks the writer and marks the story for the rest of the telling. And I guess what I wanted to impress upon people and like by writing this early on was that there wasn't really something like that for me. Like there wasn't a specific moment in my life where I felt things turned from, going positively to negatively in my childhood or something like that. It was more that I think I've identified with this sort of feeling of being paralyzed, of not wanting to speak, of being scared of other people, of being fearful of my own voice. And I think that was really the parallel I felt to that story and that instance in her life. And then when I was a kid, from 6th grade to 12th grade, I was on the forensics team, which was the speech and debate team in my middle school and high school. And I used to recite like poetry or short stories, drama, things like that, like, for competitions. And I used to recite a lot of different poems from Maya Angelou, like perform them. And I found a lot of interest and strength in that, like her words and her way of articulating womanhood. I thought was, Black womanhood in particular was really inspiring to me. And I associate that instance of, being on this team with kind of the shift from when I went from being very insular, very silent, very introverted to being able to, speak in front of rooms of people and share what I was thinking and what I was feeling, even if it was through the words of someone else. And I think, she always holds that really special place in my memory because I associate her with this transition from being this really withdrawn child to growing more and becoming more mature and feeling like I could like articulate myself in a certain kind of way. And that experience also, it was the first time I'd ever joined a team because I'm not athletic. So I'd never been like on Pee Wee baseball. I've never been on a basketball team. I've never done any of those things. But, being on a team with all these other young women, because I was in an all-girl school, so we were an all-girl team, really changed me and gave me a lot of purpose and, passion for performing and for being a more outgoing person. But I also think that letter I wrote to her is a true letter because it was written either the day of or the day after she died. Mm-hmm. And I was just reflecting on how you could have this sort of intimacy and relationship with a writer because you've read so much of their work, because it's, and I've read it over the years, like first as a very young girl, and then as I got older, then when I was in college, then now as a, faculty member, like I've returned to the work. And I think the work in some ways grows alongside you because you have this intimacy with the writer's work that then it's evolving as your understanding of yourself evolves and your understanding of the world evolves. And so, like, at 13, like, I don't think I was necessarily so tapped into the meaning of, like, Phenomenal Woman or, all these poems that I was reading. But as an older person now, I think they have different resonance and different meaning to me.
It's really fascinating. Thank you, Danielle. Well, in closing, we love to celebrate small presses, and your press is called Jaded Ibis Press. And this is the kind of press that, you can't help but want to celebrate and elevate. It's a feminist press committed to publishing socially engaged literature with an emphasis on voices of color. And then the press was named after the James Hurst story, The Scarlet Ibis. So can you share with us a bit about how Dandelion ended up there?
Yeah, so actually, there was an essay, like another contest. So I was looking for a publisher, and I had like shopped this book around and, sent it out to agents and other people. And I was having, different responses. I got some nice letters from agents that were basically like, this is a very unusual book for a large press. And I got one that was like, if you did this and this and this and this and this, like maybe it could be something that'd be more for a large press. And I was like, I don't want to do any of those things. So I, kind of was sticking to my guns, and I wanted to write the book I wanted to write. So towards, I want to say it was like 2023 or 2024, I started looking at small presses. And I, had read things from Jay Dybus before, and they had a contest that they had just started called the Uplift Voices Prize. And I saw this, on Submittable or something like that, or maybe it was Instagram, and I just decided to submit. So I sent in the manuscript. It was named one of the 3 finalists, and they reached out to me to let me know that. And I was really excited about that. And then it won the contest a couple months after that. So,
nice.
And I was just, excited to find a home where people were excited about the book I wanted to write and not trying to make me write like, Girl Interrupted, but something different. Like that's not even shade about that book. I like all different kinds of work. I just think I wasn't trying to write that book, and I wanted to write the book I wanted to write. And they were just such a huge support. The owner of the press, Elizabeth Early, and Dion, who is my developmental editor, and Carmen, who's the press manager, like all of them have just been so great to work with, to collaborate with, and to help me, promote the book that I wanted to actually put out.
It's awesome, Danielle. I loved it. We're going to be recommending it because Grant and I are kind of on a kick about these memoirs that have different forms. And it's a real, like I said, the essay I mentioned earlier is a tour de force, but so is the whole book. So congrats and thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle.
We'll be right back with today's book trend. Well, today's trend is about mass market, which is a whole category of book that was really popular for years and years and years, but no more, Grant. When you and I were kids, I used to see mass market books at the grocery store mostly. You would see those in like the little spinny kiosks that were everywhere. And they were, always like very pacey, intense books, thrillers, kind of light horror. And specifically, I remember like some of the mass market books that I loved in the 80s when I was in middle school. I think I read literally every single book that Dean Koontz wrote. I was obsessed. V.C. Andrews, Flowers in the Attic, and its sequels. Oh my gosh, every single girl my age was devouring those books, and plenty more. And I'm just curious, what are your memories of mass market books, and did you read a lot of them?
Yeah, similarly, and I'm kind of nostalgic for them. Since I grew up in a small town, we didn't have a bookstore, but there was this all-purpose store that we'd call a convenience store now. It was called Wig's Country Store, and Wig was a man, and he stood silently behind the counter for 50 years, chomping on a cigar and not saying a word. But he also had this huge magazine section, literally hundreds of magazines, and I bought Mad Magazine and Writer's Digest and Cream Magazine there, while very sheepishly stealing glances at the nearby porn section. That was quite huge. You couldn't walk by it without looking. But there's also a series of racks of books, like the ones you mentioned. And I remember V.C. Andrews, and I remember Harlequin novels, but there were also the odd literary novels. It was such a weird place to encounter this, but I was introduced to Jonathan Updike on these racks, and I also remember buying Jonathan Livingston Seagull and reading Ordinary People and Love Story. So I'm beholden to mass market books for my early reading experiences, really.
I know. And I'm nostalgic too. I do feel like we cover the death of a lot of things for these trends. And it's kind of hard. And, we've said before, we're sorry because we know we tend toward the negative and the trends. And we can look at all of these losses and grieve, or we can look at these losses as simply change and progress. And I am trying to do that a little bit because, where mass market is concerned, I am more nostalgic than sad. Like, I have not bought a mass market book in years, and I'm talking years. And so it's not like I was supporting their continuation.
Yeah, Brooke, I hear you. Sometimes I find myself saying things and I can't believe how much I sound like my parents, longing for how things used to be, like in the early 90s. And I think it's a hazard of aging, and progress does feel scary at times, especially right now because of AI and all the things that are breaking and all the things we seem to be losing. But we also know that change is a constant. I always think about those people who resisted the Model T or the early car. And so we probably should be looking at all this change through more optimistic eyes. For example, I'll take the modern day audiobook over books on tape any day.
Right. Good point. And, over the weekend, I went to visit an old publishing friend of mine who's in his late 70s, and he just lost his wife, and we were just catching up on the industry. And I was telling him about my feelings about AI and just generally stating what a threat I think it is to the book publishing world and to writing. And he very matter-of-factly was like, yeah, I'm sure people felt the same way, when the calculator was invented, that it was going to just let people do math without having to do the calculations in their head. And he went on to muse that in a couple of generations, this is just going to be a non-issue, that people will just use AI to write and people won't write anymore. I, of course, found this incredibly depressing, but the way he delivered it, and he's like a generation older than me, was a little bit sobering. He was like, you're making a lot out of nothing, and essentially we have no control. And it was helpful, because it did help me to think about how worked up I get about things that are 100% out of my control. So, perhaps that's the trend. Nothing is in our control.
That's right. I think we're helpless with this one. And I also like to think that humans are fundamentally creators, fundamentally storytellers. So we will always write stories. But back to mass market, we'll just spare our listeners another eulogy like we did for the Washington Post. But suffice it to say that mass market had a good run. And I have great memories of my own mass market paper books, which even if they had survived my many moves and all these decades, would likely be in tatters because they were just so cheap, which is the entire point of them. And I'm sure there'll be collector's items now, going, the way of old baseball cards and such, more vintage things to go along with our vintage memories, Brooke.
Totally. It's so funny because I'm turning 50 this summer, and I'm doing this big girls trip with 9 of my friends, and we're all born in 1976. And one of the women sent a t-shirt, via text that she found online, and it reads vintage 1976. And she wants us all to buy them and wear them for the weekend. And I was like, yes, that's right. Yeah. I have arrived, and Grant, I know that you recently turned 60, but I was just thinking 50 is the age when we can start to call ourselves vintage for sure. Mm-hmm. And mass market is vintage. Au revoir, kids. Our kids are going to read about these in history books, and that's going to be it.
Yeah, I think that's super fun about your birthday extravaganza, Brooke. And as I've told you, I think you should write a screenplay or somehow make it into a documentary or something. And as you know, I make it a point to do something big and significant for each of my milestone birthdays. And I always said that 50 is the age your mortality peaks at you over the horizon. But 60 is the age when you find it staring at you from across the room. And actually, I now see 50 as this young, practically sprightly moment in life or year. But it is vintage also, as you say. And my kids love digging through my closets for old clothes. And I wish I would have saved some of them for them, except not the mass market paperbacks, because they were cheap. But on that note, I want to remind listeners to sign up for Memoir Nation. You'll find it at memoirnation.com, because we are here to help you dig through the closets of your memories and write the stories of your life. These types of stories are timeless. We'll be back next week with more memoir tips, stories, advice, longings, mournings, and more. So see you then.